What we're going to do is have a bit of a discussion with our three panelists, and there'll be some time for some Q&A as well, so please do feel free to think about questions, and we'll try and get around as many questions as we can toward the end of the session. So to kick us off, we're going to come to you, Anton, and I mentioned here Smith in Glasgow, and Smith's links to Glasgow. Can you really give just an audience an overview about Adam Smith and his links to the university and his time here as a student, professor, rector?
Thank you, Graham, and delighted to be here, although I feel a bit of a fraud alongside two real experts. And as Graham said, I'm not a historian of thought or indeed a historian of philosophy. So Adam Smith is a really major figure in the University of Glasgow. He came here as a student at the age of 14. He studied logic, metaphysics, maths. Later he also studied Newtonian physics and moral philosophy. Then he actually temporarily moved to Oxford on the Snell Scholarship, which is a link between which still exists today between Glasgow and Balliol College. We still have Snell scholars going to Oxford for short periods. Then in 1751, at the age of 28, he returned as Professor of Logic, and then became, the following year, Professor of Moral Philosophy. And then he held the chair of moral philosophy until 1764. I want to pick up on 2 or 3 elements. I mean, I can't give you a full biography of Smith, but he had a really important role in the university throughout his time here. He occupied a role called the Dean of Faculties. So he was responsible for the recruitment, for the appointment and retention of academic staff, which, you know, even in those times and in these times, was a pretty key role. He was also he had a role called the quaestor, which is a Latin term in terms of being in charge of the finances for the university library. So actually, he got to choose the volumes that would help him certainly think about his research. But he also, I think, played a really influential role even after he left, because he then was elected rector of the university, which allowed him to chair effectively key committees after this is between 1787 to 1789. But the second point I wanted to make is that he really played an important role in the life of the University of Glasgow. He was a participant in Down and Down events, joined the Lord Provost under the Cochrane's Political Economy Club, and took a keen interest in the development of the city. He was also really good at networking with other key professors at the time. Obviously, he'd been taught at Glasgow by Francis Hutcheson, and you see a lot of that influence of Francis Hutcheson in his writings in the theory of moral sentiment, but even beyond that. But he also did work hugely with other professors. He had a great love of mathematics, so Robert Simpson taught him Euclidean geometry. And that really inspired, I think, Smith's commitment to systematic thinking. He was a great admirer of Newton, and again saw that as an important part of the way in which he looked at his own discipline and tried to bring it into a kind of order, if you like. But he also was a very good friend of other professors here, the chemist Joseph Black, Professor of Medicine William Cullen, James Wharton was an instrument maker, so he really did believe in stretching beyond his own discipline. And so I think he had a massive influence on Glasgow. He's obviously, I think, given the influence he's had on thinking in political economy and economics, people do look at his time in Glasgow as being really important, even though when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he had left the university. The theory of moral sentiment was very much based on his teaching here. But actually, just to finish, I have a facsimile of a letter he wrote to the university in 1787 when the student elected him rector. And he basically said, in a letter of thanks to the then principal, he said, he remarkably remembered his professorial days at Glasgow as being, and I quote, by far the most useful and therefore by far the happiest and most honourable period of my life. So obviously for him the bond with Glasgow was really important. So I'll stop there, Graham, but actually understanding his relationship with Glasgow University and the city, I think, was really important to understand this.
And just pick up, Jesse, that talk about the city. So a young Adam Smith, sitting a student here in Glasgow, and then as a young professor, looking out his window at the city, what would he have seen, and how might that have influenced his thinking?
I mean, it's an incredibly interesting question. So Smith arrives in Glasgow in 1737, and he doesn't leave until the early 1760s. So there's a period, an interspersed period. He's got some time at Oxford where he has a rotten time. Vastly prefers Glasgow as an education institution. There's much better time here. And when he arrives in Glasgow, Scotland, and indeed throughout this entire period, is going through an incredible process of change. So we've had the Union of 1707, which has brought England and Scotland together. It's meant that the problems that Scotland, I mean, it's a highly contested topic even now, but it meant that the problems that Scotland had before, economic problems, which were of being squeezed out by the Navigation Acts from trade and of not having any capital and using what capital it had rather ineffectively on a great expedition to Darien in Panama, and of being essentially under-industrialized, under-capitalized, and a rather rural country. That was all starting to change. There was a period of adjustment which was quite painful after 1707, but by the time you get to the 1740s, Scotland is really starting to move forward, and in the 1750s, once the last of the Jacobite rebellions, as it were, political religious disruption has passed through, Scotland begins a process, or is already engaged in a process of economic change, which is going to power it for the next 150 years. It becomes the kind of Asian tiger of the global economy in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So he's at the beginning of an incredible process of change. He's also at the beginning of a process of change that isn't just social, economic, but also social and political. So the divisions between Highlands and Lowlands, the divisions between Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Catholics, the divisions between people who spoke Gaelic and people who spoke English, those are starting to erode. And how does this feed into Smith? So you can see processes of change, very radical change, rapid change around him, and they in turn feed into his theory of how society evolves, because he has a stage theory which goes from, in his way of thinking, a kind of hunter phase of society to a shepherd's phase to what you might call agriculture and ultimately to commercial society. And at each stage, the nature of the human relationships change, the nature of the legal arrangements change, property becomes a different thing in each context, and of course the nature of the polity changes, and hierarchy is slowly built up and then eroded. And the great reason why, one of the reasons he loves commercial society, a society in which he says everyone is, as it were, a merchant and lives by exchanging, is because it is a society in which people are presumptively equal. And so they're able to trade, in his view, not just goods and services, but also moral values and language. And all of those things are taking place in different speeds, in different ways in the Scotland that he sees. If he looks outside the window, final point in Glasgow, he would see a port which, if not quite a slave port, was a port heavily involved in the importation of tobacco and sugar, enormously benefited from the being taken inside the purview of the Navigation Acts rather than outside, which required tobacco to be landed in a port. By the time you get to the 1750s, Glasgow is doing more trade in tobacco than the whole of the English ports combined. So you can see extraordinary processes of development going on around him, and they would have fed directly into his experience through Cochrane's Club, through his knowledge of the great tobacco barons in Glasgow at the time, and then into his wider theory.
So maybe he was clearly not just in a time of upheaval and change within Scotland and the UK, but also globally. One of the things that's quite interesting when you read Smith, the examples he gives are very international in that context. So what was the global context at that time that Smith was remarking on or looking out the window beyond the gaze of the port to the ships like that?
Yes, and it's quite difficult, I think, this session was advertised as hard, as changed the world, which I think is a difficult one to kind of pin down, but the sense of the period he's in, Why do we remember Adam Smith as certainly the free trade, taking on this point about becoming, after the 1707, becoming inside of the free trade system, or the Navigation Act system. And it's that sort of sense of, okay, we all remember Adam Smith as being pro-free trade, and most economists believe free trade is the best thing we should do. But of course, one of the things is, in fact, at the time, we're thinking about the mercantilist period, which Adam Smith and classical economics is moving away from, when trade is determined by monopoly trading companies, which are given monopolies by governments. And that's what Adam Smith's, one of his, if we think he changed the world, it's breaking down those kind of monopoly trading companies. But of course, the other side of opening up free trade is not free trade, it's within the Navigation Acts, and it's sort of enforced free trade. You go out and conquer somewhere and you enforce free trade. And there's lots of quite interesting literature about the setback that China had when its ports were opened up in the name of free trade. So Adam Smith is writing in this period against, he's setting himself up, or he's setting up their argument against this mercantilist monopoly trading. So I think that's the most kind of important thing about him in the world in that sense, about how, if we want to pinpoint what difference it made. But in terms of kind of the history of economics, it's the same sort of space. Historians of economics think of him as being the beginning of this move away from the mercantilist into what's called the classical period, which depends on which puts forward the view that value comes from labour. It's labour that puts value into things, as opposed to consumers valuing things, and that's where we decide how value comes, which is late 19th century. So there's a period from Smith to Marx in which the labour theory of value is holding sway across the space of economics or political economy. But he's also, at the same time, if I can add in, his writing at the same time as the physiocrats in France, and both Adam Smith and his physiocrat group in France are trying to create not a model of the economy, but how the whole system works. So it's not a kind of narrow mechanical object, but an attempt to figure out how the solar system works, how these kind of astronomical viewpoints, how do all the bits fit together, and how the dynamics of that, what changes what, and how do these things work together. So it's a systematic approach to trying to get hold of the whole system, which historians of economics will focus on as being perhaps one of the major moves, not just by Adam Smith, but that period when political economy is sort of born. It's not just the economics, it's the politics and the social changes.
So Anton mentioned Smith's interaction with other classical scholars at the time, and something was said about Smith is he didn't actually have anything new himself, but what he did do was write a coherent way of evidence and thinking that really already happened. The way what he did was pulled it together in that primary context, or in a broader sense of a commercial cycle. I mean, that's fair. Who are the other thinkers that would be interested in at the time?
It's not my period at all. So I'm sure probably this has more to say on it. But it is that sense of creating an account of the whole, which I think gets lost, actually. When people say, oh, he's the first person to think of general equilibrium. No, I mean, that's not how you think of it. That's
no, I entirely agree. I think you can think of the Smith's theory of value is a really interesting question if you want to go into it, because there are two theories that he's kind of running at the same time. There's the core kind of labour theory of value, which people associate later with Marx, as Mary pointed out. But there's also what you might call a market consumerist theory of value lurking in there as well. It's not a fully resolved picture of Smith. And that, I think, points to a rather interesting thing. It's been a very effective and successful way of thinking about Smith, which is to regard him as an antecedent to general equilibrium theories, static conceptions of how economies work, and they've been unbelievably influential for reasons we all understand. And the Aaron Harwood book about which acknowledges Smith in that sense as an antecedent. But actually, I think in my book, I argue for a more dynamic understanding of Smith. I think Smith is in some respects more, dare I say, even Austrian. I mean, he's got more of a sense of a kind of evolved, emergent properties at the level of the economy, but also in political economy, and of course there's interesting in economics as such at this time. And I think that's a really productive and interesting way of thinking about him, which is possibly a bit underexplored. The reason we go back to him now, as opposed to, say, James Stewart or Tucker or other contemporary figures, is because we tend to think of Smith as being the first person who puts markets at the centre of political economy, and that's an absolutely foundational move. As to whether Smith is, as it were, an innovator, I think that move is in itself a rather profound innovation in the way in which economics is presented. And it's certainly true that he adapts and expands and explores, sometimes quite often without attribution, insights of others. But it's also true that there are elements that are, I think I would argue, if not absolutely new, then he really makes the foundational contributions in. And an obvious example would be this stadial theory of human society, which has a few emphases, but really not many, and he gives it an extraordinarily fleshed out development. And also, I don't think we need to worry too much about the fact that Wealth of Nations comes later, because of course there's that great memorandum of 1755 which he anticipates the same ideas. And we know, you think of the different books, the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the unpublished lectures on jurisprudence, which are absolutely key linking element, and then the Wealth of Nations. It's the fact that you can see this incredible horizontal development that allows one to anchor a lot of this stuff in his gratitude experience.
I mean, I was going to just add a couple of things to this. I mean, I think to someone like myself who's a macro economist, hasn't really done a history of thought, the one thing that really jumps out at you if you do read the Wealth of Nations, for instance, is this understanding of the interaction between economic and political markets and political institutions. And of course, many economists regard that as being kind of an innovation of the 20th century, the new political economy. But actually, you see a lot of that jumping out at you. He's a very sophisticated thinker also in terms of the interaction between political institutions and markets. And even when it comes to attacking mercantilism, he's a gradualist. He understands that there are political barriers to these issues, even when he discusses the problem of the American colonies and the problem of the American. One other point about his influence, I also think his influence needs to be traced through the people who came after him. So someone like John Miller of Glasgow, professor of civil law, I mean, you mentioned this in the lecture of jurisprudence, there's no doubt that his thinking had a huge influence on people like Miller and others who then took part in the abolitionist movement, who argued strongly against, for the abolition of slavery and the reform of institutions like that. So I think it's really interesting to think of people who were taught by Smith and then had a huge impact.
So we also hear at the Royal Economic Society and the Scottish Economic Society conference, we really talk a bit about his contribution to the discipline. So how Smith's approach to thinking about the economy, political economy, has there been a legacy through to how academics engage in economics? And are there any traces golden threads through from his own writings through the academic behaviour or misbehaviour today?
Yes, so I bought a long copy. You see it's a bit of a heavyweight, and this is not the whole book. This is part of it. But if you've never read any of the Wealth of Nations, this is the definitive edition, very cheap as well for Liberty Press, but it's worth reading because one of the things I think that follows through in this golden thread is something about his style. I mean, his style is very engaging, which is why at the time it was well read, people took it on. But I think there's something there for modern economists, and the thing I think is there is this funny little kind of snippets of stories. So probably when I was undergraduate, you go to a seminar or a class from a graduate student, you go to a seminar, and there'd be a model on the board, and someone would say, the story here might be. Right? That's exactly the kind of thing, I think, that comes out of Adam Smith's way he writes. So traditionally we have the thinking about market dilemmas, or some little story that's prompted some nice piece of economics, which often gets lost in the publication, but it's part of the verbal tradition of why we thought about something like this. And I think that's something we inherited from the way Adam Smith writes. So you don't have to read very far in this book to get to the Pin Factory, or the exchange of why people are different from dogs, because dogs fight over bones will be exchanged in humankind. all of those little kind of stories which Adam Smith brings in to not just illustrate, but as part of the motivation and reasoning of how to think about this particular problem, how to think about the market, how to think about the division of labour. They are motivational for us as economists thinking about the problem, to explore the problem and reason about the problem, rather than just stylistic things. So that's, for me, one of the things I think goes through from Adam Smith, even if it's been lost in our current publications, but not lost, actually, when economists sit down and write books. You'll find they'll put them in the books. They won't be in the papers, but go to many of the books that our most famous economists have written, and they'll be in there. So there's something about the inherited use of little chunks of narrative as a way of reasoning about something, not just illustrating the problem. So that's for me one of the...
Jesse, one of the other striking things is just how much evidence you use, and as I mentioned, from different disciplines, how there's a core evidence piece coming through with. I mean, is that quite good? Does that set him apart from other scholars of the day of just how much you use insights and evidence and experiences from elsewhere?
I mean, I think the thing that's extraordinary about Smith is that he has this really interesting combination of the very particular and the sweeping in general. So at one level, he's trying to give you a discharge of the great Enlightenment project that you find sketched out, and he's touched on it at the beginning of the Human Treatise. You know, the idea is you do a complete account of the science of man, as it were, across a whole range of apparently different disciplines, and connecting, in his case, what you might call sociology, psychology, social and individual psychology, philosophy, ethics, political economy, theory of politics, theory of law. I mean, it's a staggeringly wide range, a theory of communication. I mean, it's a staggeringly wide-ranging idea. So that thing is amazingly fertile and productive and interesting, and goes far beyond anything we would ever think of doing now in kind of the very focused disciplinarity that we have in modern academic life. But at the same time, he's prepared to be extremely particular. So, you know, he gives you a general theory of how markets work in different forms, but he also gives you very precise descriptions of how markets work. Or how the market for herrings work is a long excursus on the market for herrings. I mean, that's what he does. And that, I think, is one of the things why, alongside this brilliant little homilies and examples that Mary's pointed out, which come out of his he was regarded as a very effective classroom teacher and lecturer. One of the things that comes alongside is also a kind of respect for evidence and for individuality. And since I personally think no market is the same as any other market, I think markets like primary schools and individuals, I think it's extremely exciting that you can have a nuanced set of tools for thinking about how market structure works. And these days, you know, you're the economist, not me, but I would have thought that, you know, when we think about primary, secondary markets, think about asset markets, think about markets for, you know, different kinds of money and land and, you know, consumer goods. We're inheritors of this kind of variegated tradition. I suppose the other thing about Smith is that he is prepared to be funny and apathegmatic as well as sweeping. And this does make him, even at the length that we're talking about, rather a good read.
And I guess 2 books in 30 years probably doesn't make an ideal candidate for ref submissions. But you mentioned it, he's writing it's quite political with a small p at the time, isn't it? You know, he's capitalism in City of Glasgow is huge, and his books are quite controversial in that regard, isn't it? He doesn't pull his punches.
No, he doesn't pull his punches, and you know, again, that's a feature of a lot of the writers of that period, which is fascinating because, of course, they would have been speaking to the sons of merchants in these lecture theatres, saying, "Guys, you've got it all wrong." But I think what's really striking, I wanted to pick up on a piece here around evidence and how he uses evidence. But he also argues strongly that evidence is important around formulating policy, which we could actually borrow certainly in this present time and the 21st century as we think about economics. I mean, he basically says, you know, the intention of a lot of policy isn't to create bad things. He was talking about the Corn Law in Group 4. But he basically said it wasn't the intention to create dearth of imports and food supply, but actually the reality is it's a bit caused by the effect. So he said, don't look at the intent, look at evidence in formulating policy. And that is actually a really modern notion as well of thinking in that way. And so I suspect that's probably how the device will be used in his teaching. You kept saying, look at the evidence. You may prefer that particular position, but look at the evidence about what causes the markets, what that causes in terms of current conditions. But again, let me mention the gradualism piece, because he was well aware of the issues. And it's interesting how even some of the things he said around the American policy and the policy towards the colonies. As a result, as I understand it, I mean, Smith was post-American independence, was also regarded as quite an ambivalent figure by some of the founding fathers, who saw this kind of ambivalent sort of, on the one hand, yes, this was the wrong attitude that was taken by British authority. On the other hand, he effectively did believe that the colonies had to pay their way in terms of maintaining, the military spending in the home country. So it's interesting. He does hedge his bets occasionally in some of what he likes. But Jesse, you probably know more about that. His ability to ride a couple of different positions as well.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's easy to forget how much practical understanding Smith has. We think of him as kind of off in an ivory tower. But this is a person who gets called in by the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the day to do some calculations and thinking about a budget. This is a person who's quite involved in different aspects of policy through his correspondence. He has a very wide-ranging library, lots of pamphlets that he reads. He ends up as a Commissioner of Customs, in which there's every issue you could imagine of kind of local trade, smuggling, the rest of it being kind of explored, and they have some pretty punitive powers in that. So he's more practical than we recall. And I mean, I don't have any interest actually written about this, but on my website, but there's a piece on political advice. So he gives a lot of political advice in the course of his life, and I think his paper in relation to what to do about the colonies is actually the kind of forerunner of the modern policy paper. Because if you think about how the best policy work is done now, canonically it explores a context, it lays out different alternatives, it goes through the costs and benefits, the different alternatives, it comes to a resolved view. His memorandum does this extraordinarily well, and would not, in a language and in a way of presentation that would not be out of place now. And it's an extraordinarily modern piece of work, and I think really interesting if you're interested in that interface between, as it were, high theory and the low practice of politics.
Jason, can you just bring up that if you go outside of the academia or people who've read Smith, they'll probably immediately think of him as being the person who coined the phrase "the invisible hand." We could be wrong with it 3 times or something, is all that it appears, and we'll see him as being free markets. I mean, how fair do you think that is? And potentially, is there actually a case to try and justify too much? That he, in some way, because we're trying to re-engineer Smith as being broader than someone who was very supportive of free markets. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I'm hopelessly biased. One key part of my book is to rebut the idea, which you get on both the left and the right of politics, that somehow Smith is a massive, neoliberal market fundamentalist, read in, as it were, deep dyed in blood and do things wrong. I mean, absolutely nothing we've heard of the truth. He of course believes in free exchange and free trade. He doesn't think free trade is going to work the whole time. He thinks sometimes you need the skullduggery of that vulgar individual known as the politician. To bloody people's noses from time to time to keep them honest within a free trading system. So again, he's not unrealistic about that. But he is remarkably good at kind of striking a balance across all of these different these different aspects, and that's another reason why I think he pays infinite study. But by the same token, he's prepared to tolerate a staggering range of interventions in markets. We seem to forget this. I mean, so he's prepared to contemplate the Navigation Acts. He's prepared to contemplate, which is probably the largest free trade intervention in the history of the world. He's prepared to contemplate special duties on alcohol. After the collapse of the Air Bank in 1772, which is a disaster for Scotland and for his great patron, the Duke of Buccleuch, and on which Smith spends quite a lot of time helping his patron to get out from under this. This is a world in which everyone's on the hook for unlimited liability for bank failures. After the disaster of the failure of that bank, he absolutely is prepared to contemplate what he calls firewalls to prevent a fire in one institution becoming a general conflagration. And there are lots of other areas where he is prepared to contemplate an intervention. So the idea that he somehow supports a world free of intervention is entirely free of the state, is entirely wrong. In fact, one of the things that's most interesting about Smith is the balance he strikes between these market-shaping decisions and his wider theory of cronyism and market intervention from government, which can involve monopoly and price fixing or toleration of price fixing and indeed empire, because he's simultaneously drawing attention to the malevolent effects of the state and also the requirement for there to be an effective state if you're going to have effective market activity at all. And that's an incredibly, to me at least, I think it's a very interesting balance.
And really, do you think that's fair? And if so, why is Smith held up as the advocate of free markets and limited government? Where did that come from?
I think that's a really interesting question, an interesting problem. I think this point made that in some ways is quite Austrian. It's in the sense that it's actually about a living, breathing economy in which people are making lots of decisions all the time. And that's what the market is. It's a sort of, that sense of a free market is that everybody matters, everybody's counted, everybody's in it. So it's not absolutely determined by a set of political laws or political institutions, because whatever those are, everybody's still making decisions and acting in the market. So I think there must have been some moment of kind of hijacking. I wouldn't like to put a moment on when that is, but that hijacking managed to forget all of these things that Jessica has been talking about government intervention, which I suppose now, the rest of people, not government intervenes, but government intervenes to make markets work. And that sort of falls an alternative framework from government shouldn't intervene because markets will work. And it's a sort of, so the European social market democracy space as opposed to the neoliberal control. And I think the other thing I want to say is actually something about the period. The 18th century, how we construct that looking back. Looking back, we tend to see the Industrial Revolution as the kind of great change. And Adam Smith's stadial theory goes out to commerce. Right? Whereas, someone coming in the late 19th century won't stop commerce because they'll stop it in the Industrial Revolution or a very different framework of how trade's not driving the world, it's manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution. And over the last 20 years or so, economic historians have redrawn or renumbered the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, and it points out how important what's called now the Industrial Revolution is, which is the period of Adam Smith. And the focus on division of labour in Adam Smith then makes a lot more sense because it's about taking craft industry out of the guilds and making it available to everyone, making those craft goods available to everyone, buckles on your shoes, all of those sort of ornamental things. And that's a very different division of labour process, which doesn't depend, which drives machines, but doesn't envisage anything like the Second Industrial Revolution and the late 19th century, where you make machines to make machines, as opposed to making machines to make things. So I think we forget that whole difference of looking out the window. I think of him as the beginning of that whole big change in the way we make things. He only goes up to commerce instead. I think that's that's partly why the trade stuff is so important, because it's connected with commerce rather than making things.
Just before we come to some questions, if Adam Smith was to walk through that door, what would you ask about, apart from asking me why I put it in the water, but what come to you, Anton first, what would you ask him about, from a question from today, what would you ask him?
Actually, it probably follows on what Mary's described. I would love to hear his take on, this wider prospect around economic history and what came after his time, because we've said already, he was cautious, he was balanced, I think, in his approach. He keeps talking, warning against speculative physicians and saying, don't think there are simple answers to complicated questions. It would have been really interesting to see somebody with that approach look at what happened in the time since he was there and reflect on that incredible period of technological development, of change, of further change in society, and what he thought then about the balance of what institutions represented by the state, by market regulation, etc., how that fits with his view of how markets function. It would be really fascinating to hear his view on that. As well as, of course, the fact that he was ultimately somebody who was also a philosopher and wrote a theory of moral sentiments. How does that relate to a modern world? But it's the obvious questions.
Jesse?
It's just, there's so many questions you'd like to ask about where to begin. Who are you backing on Love Island? I suppose I had two questions. One is, what was in the 18 notebooks that you had destroyed? You forced your executives to destroy before you were dead. That's what I'd like to know. But the other thing is, if we ever get an automated general intelligence, we can actually get beyond the kind of obvious limitations of these large language models and chatbots. I'm looking forward to SmithBot at Glasgow, University of Glasgow, where we can actually ask some of these questions and hopefully have a kind of well-primed kind of idea or understanding of what the generative intelligence of his might be like, because there's no limits to his own intelligence, and therefore there's no limits to the questions that one could put to him, and I think we illuminated by the answer.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't want to ask him anything direct, but I'd like to have him and Karl Marx in the same room. Because they both want to live a theory of value, and I can imagine both of them saying, how do you get it so wrong? So I'd like to have that conversation about them being in the same theoretical space, but being so different in their framings.
Great. And we've got about 5-10 minutes for questions from the audience. We don't have microphones, so you can maybe just shout out, be quite loud in your voice, and we'll be able to come to you. So there's a question, the gentleman at the back.
Yeah.
There is no microphone, you just have to ask your question.
So,
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the quite sharing the Adam Smith's history. And as you said, Adam Smith was not just economics; he was like philosopher and thing. My question is that why when Adam Smith has a lot of work, that the wealth of nations becomes so popular, even in the first year of the university economics understand, but the theory of moral sentiment, it's not that's so. And I want your reflection on that and how that can, what does, he has here the wealth of nations and then here the theory of sentiment, and how that can affect today's, moral deficit and morality crisis. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I guess, general question, what's the contribution of the theory of moral sentiment? We've spoken quite a bit about wealth of nations, and that's probably the most influential from an economics point of view. So what can you learn from, I guess, from today's more economic debates from the theory of moral sentiments? Jesse?
So if you go back to the previous question, which is how have we come to misunderstand Smith as a market fundamentalist in the way that we have? So one of the ways in which that's happened is that we focused entirely on what we now think of as economic incentives, particularly those that are mathematically tractable. And actually, an awful lot of the recent process of doing things about this area is undoing some of the downsides that come with those upsides. And one of them is going back to, the counterpart of that was separating out the two works, right? So the theory of model centers was about an early foray into altruism, best forgotten by people doing economics, versus the Wealth of Nations, which is hard-headed, as it were, good neoliberal libertarian stuff. Of course, that's all nonsense. It's one project that he starts and he's working his way through. And therefore, the idea that when you get to the Wealth of Nations, that you somehow left this world of moral regard, shared moral regard, trust, intercommunication, social norm setting is nonsense. That's part of the wider picture. So I think as we get smarter about economics, we think a lot about political economy these days, we're going to go back and think about more about that world of trust and of rhetoric and of persuasion that he thinks about in that earlier work.
Just to add, I mean, we used to have this thing called that's Adam Smith problem. How did this guy write these two things? I think we've got over that now. We don't think that they were two different people. And I think one of the interesting things that we've really begun to kind of think seriously about is once we had experimental economics, we found people didn't behave and think like that, then we, in a sense, had to bring all that stuff which had been pushed out back in some way. So I think that's one of the reasons why we can put this back together again, because it's how people, how people are reasoning about why they're behaving and trusting and sharing and all of these kinds of things.
Great. Other questions?
This is a chat, so I wish to say something in protest with your permission. Yesterday I went to the Grand Old Museum and I looked for Adam Smith. After 2 hours I found it on the obscure gallery on the second floor, hiding behind that glass cabinet. Not nice. I think this university is in a position to impress on the museum, to move it to a more prominent place. May I suggest the first floor bust gallery right next to John Locke? I will follow up on that later.
Great. Well, and one of the things, the general point, the 2023 actually provides an opportunity. One of the projects that we're working on, and Angela will say a bit more about this, is to try and support a debate about Adam Smith's contribution that moves on perhaps with some of the caricatures that exist of Smith and actually make him more prominent, also within the university, but also within the discipline as well. I think it's a really important. I think it's a really important point about how we encourage a discussion about his contribution to broad sense. Angela, I'm going to say a bit more about that.
Yeah, very happy to, Graham. I mean, first of all, I should say that the only statue we have at the moment in our main building is of Adam Smith. So I think we do actually, we don't hide him away totally. So I'm sorry that we should do better in the library as well, as you suggest. The function of libraries has certainly changed over the last few years as well. They've become more study spaces than repositories of books. But to come to your point, I think what we're trying to do, as you say, is to encourage more research on his work. You and Craig Smith, who's I know is in the audience, have been working on a project around Smith the scholar, Smith the professor, Smith the citizen, with external funding. So hopefully it will lead to this revaluation of his total contribution and not simply looking at these two works in isolation. We're certainly also looking forward to the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations, the theory of all sentiments, and the Wealth of Nations, which means that we can then make this a whole period of study of Smith, not just this year with the tercentenary, but also looking forward to that other anniversary. We're looking at other ways in which we can make sure that his contribution is understood not only in economics and political economy, but also more widely this certainly resonates with not only with colleagues in the Adam Smith Business School. We have named our business school here after Adam Smith, but also resonates with other disciplines in Glasgow, which he undoubtedly influenced. So watch this space, but absolutely we need to do more to celebrate him. I totally agree with that.
I mean, because Smith made the completely fatal mistake in the modern world of not having a portrait made of himself. So we don't really know what he looked like. It's the hideous truth of the matter. If you go to the Hunterian, which I think you will, now that it's been rehung, you will see lots of his contemporaries and those around him. And if you go to the National Portrait Gallery, you'll see more. But we don't know what he looked like. But in a sense, that is an invitation to think more reflectively about what he stands for. So to go laterally and think about what all these other people are doing and thinking about. So it's very exciting that Anton is describing this wider process of intellectual reorientation and as it were, relocation.
There's a great book by Benjamin Friedman of the intellectual background of the Glasgow relation. I would recommend it.
Yes, a Benjamin Friedman book. I entirely agree. It's a splendid book. What's it called? The Social.
I forgot. Moral religion and economics.
Very short. Thank you. Thank you, Ben Friedman.
Great, excellent. Well, I'm conscious of time, and we're about to have an Adam Smith lecture as the next contribution with Professor Sir John Vickers. So can I just thank you all for coming, and can you please join us?